objective of this report, which is a joint work between the PLUS team, the CISIC team, and the OUT team, is to assessing intersectionally the quality of representation across different components. So looking firstly at the scripting representation, meaning who is represented across a quite broad set of demographic characteristic of MPs. Then looking at substantive representation, meaning what is represented, what kind of topics, and in our case, legislative questions, topics within legislative questions are more salient or the most salient, and how they vary across the country and across parties. And then subjective representation, looking how citizens feel about representation, also in this case distinguishing across biographical characteristics. And you see already in these tables that they don't always match perfectly, because also in our case, which is I think a common trait of this panel, we work with dataset that we created in or expanded in the context of ActEU, but also with some existing data. So we work within the limitation of the data themselves. In terms of countries, we are covering some variability in terms of both northern and or western countries, both within more the north and the south of Europe, but also something that to an extent we could not do within the teams that were engaged in this work was cover Eastern Europe as well. So this is something that clearly we will not see except when we're looking at existing data, which will be for subjective representation. So starting from the scripting representation, the overall situation that we see is that underrepresentation is persistent across all groups that we were considering, so both women, youth, minorities, and LGBTQI individuals. But there are some substantial variation across country and across groups. And trying to very briefly summarize the two different patterns that we see, there are some categories, the majorities of categories of groups, where we do see substantial cross-country variation. And this is the case for women, where we had countries where there is more equal representation, and this is the case for Austria, France, and Spain, and others that are much lower, especially in the case of Greece. This is also the case for ethnic and racial minorities and LGBTQI individuals, where here we can see a bit more of the geographical patterns, meaning that the southern countries, and again, especially Greece, are further lagging behind, while we have better performance in France and the UK, and also Austria in the case of LGBTQI individuals. And then if we look at youth and educational level, here we have much less cross-country variation, in the sense that there is very severe underrepresentation across the board. And even if we look at best performers, we still do see substantial gaps. And something else we look at is differences across parties within countries. And here we can have some generalization that, again, it's very much not necessarily capturing all nuance, but where we do see progressive parties performing better in terms of adding more equal representation. And again, if you're interested in all the differences cross country, we refer you back to the full report. And if we move on to the second dimension, which is substantive representation, we look at the written questions in across 6 parliaments, and we see that issue salience is quite different across the topics that we cover, where we have climate, youth, and women's issue dominating, with much more limited attention to minority topics, with some country exception. And here I will not get to the country variation, because we really otherwise run quickly out of time, but something that we can have as a takeaway is that quite often the distinction is in terms of saliency of topics within countries, and not as much across. parties within countries. And something that we can already point out as quite interesting in terms of partisanship that we could expect is that migration is not seen as a very salient topic, even where we would expect, which is for right-wing parties. Now, something else that is quite important to look at, because it has been very much discussed within the literature, is the linkages between these two dimensions of representation, meaning if whether descriptive representation is connected to a substantive representation. So, to have the most discussed example, if more women in parliament leads to more attention to gender sensitive topics within the discourse and in terms also of policy outcome. And what we see is limited correlation for most groups where it's somewhat existent for women, but for other groups, if it's there, it's generally driven by outliers. Uh, and as you can see in the graph, we even in the groups where we do see some linkages, this is not quite marked. Coming now to the last dimension, which is subjective representation. As I mentioned at the very beginning, in this context, we were relying on existing data, which is quite limited, meaning that we are using the single question that is dedicated to this topic in the CS5 data, which only looks at whether there is any party within the political system that makes a respondent feel represented. Only covers some of the group of interest that we were trying to map, and as for some of the questions that are present, as in terms of migration background, outliers that essentially would wipe out most of the countries that we were considering. So we had to use something that is not a good match for what we're doing in the rest of the analysis, that is foreign-born status. Yet, what we see, which is very much consistent with the literature, is very marked cross-country differences, with some regional patterns or also in this case, as we see in Central and Eastern European countries, much lower aggregate overall level of feelings represented, which while we see the opposite in Nordic countries. And we see differences, especially in terms of some groups, and again, especially for some countries. So I guess this links quite well with also what the trust presentation was mentioning, that the national context may matter quite substantially in terms of feelings of representation as well. But also another takeaway that we can have from this analysis is that we discussed the importance of looking at different dimensions of representation, and this is something that for subjective representation with existing data we cannot do. And this is also, we think, one of the contributions that the ActEU project brings, because with our own survey data we will be able to disentangle how citizens feel about these different dimensions of representation as well. And again, just the visual of the difference of feelings of representation across countries that we can notice immediately are very much marked. And the other point that I forgot to mention in the previous slide, but it's very important in the context of this project as well, is that in some of these countries that has lower feelings of representation overall, youth is especially not feeling represented, and that is also something that we should care about within this project as a society in general. So coming quickly to what we try to make out of these findings, and we think are important implication to discuss, is in relation to descriptive representation. we can see underrepresentation in dimension that both could be supported by institutional mechanisms, but also would see a systemic solution, and if we would need systemic solution. And if we think about differences across parties, we can see the challenge, especially if in contexts in which progressive parties are a minority, perhaps, of improving representation, if it's driven solely by certain parties within the political spectrum, but also can be challenged as well. Now, if we look at the relationship between a descriptive and substantive representation, especially, we see that descriptive representation is not a guarantee for substantive representation, meaning that alone we are not able to produce inclusive policies just through this channel, but also that is not required for salience of issues, as we saw for climate and youth, as these are categories that are very much underrepresented, but these are topics that at least in some countries, if not in general, are quite salient. But also we didn't see a certain issue that we would expect as quite salient being very visible within the parliamentary questions that we analyze, as for example in context of for what concerns migration, even from the parties where we would expect these topics to be very much high on their agenda. And now coming to subjective representation, we also see that descriptive representation is not always required for subjective representation, as groups that we saw in the first part of the presentation as being even nearly absent, especially if we think for youth or for representative with migration background, may not have gaps compared to the reference categories in terms of feelings of representation. But again, this is not the case in many other in other contexts, especially in Eastern European countries and in the South, and especially for some group such as youth. Going back to what was mentioned before, implying that we really need much of an understanding of the contextual factors that are behind feelings of representation and the entangling between the different dimensions of representation as well, which hopefully we will come to the final conference with more on this for you as well.